Welcome to another episode of Power Core Productions and Podcastings. I'm your host, John Harrington, back to hit you with another video. And today, we're going to be starting the reboot of a famed series that we have had on Power Core Productions and Podcastings. Earlier this summer, we had the series of What If Spider-Man Was in Re-Zero. And to my surprise, a lot of people really took to that series. But I did think all in all that I could have done a much better job with the overall writing and storytelling. Now, of course, the series in and of itself was fine, and I was going to be content to just leave it on the channel as it was. But in the end, I feel like I could have done a much better job. So, along with the High School DxD Naruto series, this series was also put in the reboot category. And I do hope that you will like the updated version of this story, as I do think it's one that can be well crafted. Also, with the events of Spider-Man No Way Home coming out later this winter, there's a lot more to the story that we can make. Maybe even a potential Season 3 if you guys are up for it. Assuming that we don't get a Season 3 for Re-Zero in real time. But like High School DxD, that will remain to be seen. However, I will be covering the first two seasons of Re-Zero. Also, for Season 1, I will be using the events of the director's cut for Season 1. So you'll see that this story will be a bit longer compared to the next two parts, as the director's cut is usually much longer and there are a lot more details that are within that version than in the original 25 episode span. As far as how many videos there will be, it will be the same as before. The first 3 videos will cover Season 1, followed by the OVA, and then we will cover the final season, Season 2, in 3 episodes as well. So I do hope that you will enjoy the retelling of this story, one that I think is really dear to me, as I feel like it's combining two fandoms that you wouldn't think would go together at first, but when you put it together and you give it a chance, you can really do some amazing things. Also, with the events of Loki as well as Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, there's no telling what we can get into with this story. So I do hope that it is one that you will find rather appealing. But anyway, as always, I'm going to say thank you for supporting Power Core Productions and Podcastings, and I hope that I will continue to see your support now and in the future. But without further ado, let's get into today's video. So as always, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Sometimes death is not necessarily the end, but rather it can lead to a new beginning. Many men and women in life, at their deathbeds, they ask for one thing. It's not for money, riches, glory, or fame. They ask for time. Time is viewed as the one commodity that you can never get back. Time is something that moves forward and never backward. At least that is what we like to believe. In the world of strange, amazing, fantastic, and phenomenal creatures, they lay host to the ideas of the multiverse, the ideas of time travel, of playing God. This story delves into such themes, showing a hero's strength and resolve to overcome the obstacles in front of them. Our story begins in a familiar sight, on the barren wasteland of Titan. Tony Stark, known to the world and the universe at large as the invincible Iron Man, holds a young hero in his arms. The young man's name is Peter Parker. However, to most of the world, he is known only as the Amazing Spider-Man. This group of heroes attempted to stop the Mad Titan Thanos, from his insane conquest of the Infinity Stones. 6 of the most powerful artifacts in the universe, each stone with an ability to control one of its aspects: power, time, space, mind, soul, and reality. They had attempted to stop the Mad Titan. However, in the end, he was too much to overcome, taking the Time Stone from the one known as Doctor Strange, Sorcerer Supreme. The Mad Titan arrived to Earth, going to the land of Wakanda. There, he completed his conquest, taking the last of the Infinity Stones and completing them in his gauntlet. As he did so, with the mere snap of his fingers, all of reality began to change. Many did not know what was going on. Many could not explain the phenomena. As if in a silent whisper, half of all life in the universe began to disappear from existence, to merely not exist anymore. Their soul erased from all eternity. There would be no heaven, no hell for any of these individuals, for it would be as if they were never created in the first place. As Peter could feel his soul slowly beginning to erode and leave the plane of existence, as much as he tried to fight it, he had ultimately accepted his fate, being held in the arms of his mentor. He would simply say sorry as he would fade into dust. With half of the universe gone, it was assumed that they had all been dusted away. However, the funny thing about death is that more often than not, it is a new beginning. As Peter felt himself slipping from this plane of existence, something dark and cold latched on to him, pulling his soul from that very reality. Peter found himself swirling through a green void. He could hardly make out what he was seeing around him. He would see images and flashes of things he couldn't describe, what felt like they were real, but yet not quite. He thought as though he could see different versions of himself. He looked and saw what appeared to be Spider-Man, swinging through New York, battling a green individual, gliding on some sort of glider. He would see another version of Spider-Man, doing battle on a train against a man with multiple robotic limbs. He would see a dark and disturbing figure, one similar to himself, but sinister and evil. He would see another version of himself, battling what appeared to be some sort of lizard man. He would see himself doing battle with a man made entirely of electricity. He would see himself fighting against a mechanical rhino of sorts. He would see a figure with a dome-like head who seemed to warp reality. He would see even his own past battles with beings such as the Vulture, before ultimately all of it came to a silent end as he blinked his eyes for the final time. He would open them once more. However, he would not be dead, but he would in fact be alive. He blinked his eyes a few more times before seeing that he was standing on the side of some sort of town square. People dressed as if they were in medieval times, carrying and going about. Peter would look down at his clothing, and he would see that he were not in his iron Spider-Man suit that he had been given before, but rather he was in his homemade suit, the one that he used to use before he got his upgrades from Mr. Stark. He also had a school backpack on, although how he had no clue. As he took off his mask, the people would look at him strangely, as they had never seen someone as oddly dressed as him. He looked down at his wrist and see that he had his rather bulky web shooters once again. He could have sworn that he had left his suit at home, so why did he have it on now? As he looked around, he could see that he were not in Titan anymore. He definitely wasn't in New York, but this looked as if it were still Earth. He would jump high into the air, jumping on the rooftops, some of the people yelling at him to get down. He would apologize profusely as he would continue to run. He saw that his web shooters still worked, although the buildings were not too high, so web swinging might not have been an option. But he was able to get higher ground before finding a secluded area. As he looked over the land, he realized that he was not in his home anymore. He saw things that were of fantastic nature, anthropomorphic beings, lizard men, half-elves, things of that nature. He saw them conversing and mixing with the humans, as if this were some sort of world from Dragons and Dungeons. Pierre had wondered if such a thing as isekai could even be in existence here. After all, he was familiar with the trope from his world, but the idea that he could have actually been pulled here seemed to be far from impossible. However, when you live in the world that he lives in, things such as this probably happen more often than he wanted to believe. As he continued to survey the area, he would see a young girl about to be ran over by a cart. His hero instincts would kick in immediately, as he would swing forward and save the young girl, much to the applause of the people, as they cheered in approval of the strange man that saved her. After getting the young girl to safety, Pierre would continue his travels through the land, unsure of where he was. However, what he would learn was that he was in a world not too different from his own. As he continued his walk, he would look through his bag to see if he had anything of importance. He had his smartphone, as well as some snacks and some school books, and a change of clothes into his regular attire that he wore when he wasn't Spider-Man. He debated if he should put them on, but there probably wouldn't be any need to. After all, in a world like this, his secret identity probably wasn't all that important in the grand scheme of things. Instead, he would adjust his mask into that of a beanie, walking about, as he would soon make his way over to a fruit stand, where a man would call over to his attention. "Hey kid, you want to buy some apples? Freshly picked." I'm sorry, what? "Apples. Never seen them before?" "Oh, apples. Apples. Never really heard of apples before. We just call them apples. You new from around there or something, kid?" Yeah, you could say that. Where actually am I exactly?" Well, you're in the capital of Lagunica. So, you some stranger? What town you from?" Queens, New York." "New York? Never heard of that. So anyway, you gonna buy some or not?" "Oh, yeah, let me check real quick." Pierre would look through his wallet to see if money here were any good. He had a couple of bills and some coins. However, the apple salesman would tell him that the coins were worthless, and that if he were flat out broke, he could simply get out of here. Pierre would continue his walk through the city. Now knowing that he was in a land called Lagunica, he could definitely tell that he had been isekai to another world, of all the things that happened. But more importantly, what was happening back at home? Had Thanos been defeated? Did he do something with the Infinity Stones? Did the Gauntlet send him here? And if so, how could he get back? Where could he possibly go? He wasn't skilled in magic or any of the mystic arts. And while he was, in his own way, intelligent, he wasn't smart enough to build intergalactic or interdimensional transportation. Unless the Avengers actually came to get him, for all intents and purposes, he was most likely stuck here. And that alone filled him with dread. As he walked, he would find his way going down an alley. As he looked over to the other side, 3 rather uneventful muggers would arrive, trying to rob him. Pierre would simply shake his head, realizing that crime just seemed to happen no matter what world he went to. And he would easily web them up against the wall, as they were still super strong and they had no way of breaking out so easily. As he continued his journey, a small girl would rush past him. A girl with short blonde hair, as she leaped and jumped about across the buildings. Pierre wondered what she was in such a rush for, but he would pay it no mind. As not too long after, another girl would enter into the alley. A girl with pointy ears and long silver hair. She would point to Pierre and ask if he were responsible for stealing her insignia. Although Pierre would be very confused at all this, he would deny that he had done anything wrong, but the girl would be in no time for foul play. She would launch a form of ice at Pierre dodging in amazement to think that someone actually had ice magic. However, before the girl could persist any further, another voice could be heard in the alley. From out of nowhere, a small floating cat would appear by the young girl's side, telling her that he sensed no ill intent from Peter, and that he was more than likely telling the truth. The young girl would go up to Peter and apologize for her assumptions. Peter would tell her that they were fine, and he would ask if she were okay. She would explain that she were in no time for small talk, as she had something stolen from her and she needed to find it. For Peter, finding stolen things was kind of in the job description. So he would tell her that he would help her find whatever she were looking for. The young girl would be hesitant, as she had no real reason to trust him, from his strangely dressed clothing to whatever his weird abilities were. Although she could see that from the spider on his chest, he must have been skilled in some sort of spider magic or something. Pierre would shake his head, saying that it wasn't really magic, more so than he had gotten bitten by a radioactive spider, and now he could do all the things that a spider could do. The young girl would be impressed, although she would ask if he could do everything a spider could do, why couldn't he make his own webbing? Pierre would actually be stumped for a moment, as he would wonder why he couldn't make his own webbing, and why that was the one thing the spider bite didn't give him. He should have his own organic webbing, or at least some version of Spider-Man should. Unknown to him, one actually does. The young cat would introduce himself as Puck, Peter being immensely excited to see a magical animal, a familiar of sorts. He never thought that he would actually see one here. He was truly amazed. Puck would be happy to meet Peter also, as he would introduce himself. He would also ask for the young girl's name, but she would be a bit hesitant. However, after thinking it over, she would give him the name Satella. Puck would simply shake his head, knowing full well the truth, but would simply play along none the same. As the group made their way through the city, they would ask Peter more about why he was dressed the way he was, and just where did he come from. Peter would try to explain that he was from a place called Queens, New York, and that the reason why he was dressed like this was because he was a superhero. They were familiar with the term of hero, but superhero was something unfamiliar to them. Peter would say that it was probably like a knight or something here in this world. He basically went around saving people from evil and from bad things. and they were able to put two and two together, thinking that that was admirable, although why he dressed so funny while he saved people was kind of unfamiliar, saying that he seemed to be more like a jester than anything else, although Peter would be very adamant that he was a hero, known to many as Spider-Man. "Oh, I see. So, you are Sir Spider?" No, I'm just Spider-Man." "But you said your name was Peter." "Yeah, that's my real name, Peter Parker." "Oh, so your title is Spider-Man." "Yeah, Spider-Man, because I, does whatever a spider can, swing by a web, whatever. As they continued their search, Satella would be a bit surprised that Peter wasn't too worried about being seen with a half-elf, Peter remarking that he thought elves were pretty cool, although Satella would say that many thought of them as bad luck. Although Peter would remark that in the world he came from, there were a whole lot of people who looked strange and could do amazing things. He would tell Satella and Puck about the group that he worked with, the Avengers, Earth's mightiest heroes. He would tell of people like the Soldier Out of Time, Captain America, the Invincible Iron Man, the Incredible Hulk, the Sorcerer Supreme, Doctor Strange, the Guardians of the Galaxy. They would all be amazed at these stories, to learn that Peter were around people of such power. As they continued and made their way, they would help a young girl who were lost, eventually reuniting her with her mother. As they made their way, they would soon come across the Appa Man once again. He would be ready to kick them out. However, when he learned that they had helped his daughter earlier, then he had no problem giving them a hand. As they were telling them the girl that they were looking for, he would remark that the only one here known for pickpocketing was a young girl named Felt, and that she could be found in the slums. As the sun was beginning to set, Puck would slowly begin to fade, Peter wondering if he were alright. He would explain that he was a spirit and he was running low on his mana, and that he had to return back to the jewel that Satella wore around her neck. He would ask Peter to look after her as he would go back into his slumber, Satella thanking him for all of his help. As the two continued to look for Felt, Satella would then ask some of the lesser spirits from the surrounding areas to see if they could give them good direction. Peter watched in awe as she was surrounded by the glowing lights. As nighttime came, they would soon find themselves in front of the loot house. Peter and Satella having gotten directions from a kind stranger as they were walking by. As they arrived, Peter would tell Satella to stay outside, while he would go to check things out and make sure that everything were okay. Satella would tell Peter to be careful, but he would assure her that everything would be fine. After all, this was what heroes do. As the full moon shined upon them, Peter would take the lamp and walk into the loot house. It would be immensely dark, and outside of the lamp it would be pretty hard to see what was around them. "Hey, is anyone here? Hello? Anybody home?" Oh man. Although why would I expect a loot house to be open at this time of night? "Hey, is anybody home?" Huh? What the? Why is the floor so wet? Peter would nervously continue his walk. However, as he shined his light to the floor, it was wet, but it was not with water. But instead, what covered the floor was a dark, crimson red liquid. As he shined his light a little further, he would be absolutely terrified at what he saw. the mutilated body of an old man, as well as the young girl. Oh God. What the? Who did this? Oh shit! Peter would duck out of the way as a blade would nearly cut off his head. As he turned, he could see a silhouette in the darkness. My. You certainly have good reflexes, don't you? What the hell? Did you do this? Yes. Don't you love it? Their entrails. They're so amazing. I wonder what yours will be like. You are sick. Peter and the lady would then charge at one another. Peter being taken aback at how fast she was. Her blades, even though she only had 2 in each hand, it looked as if she were moving with 8 all at once. They were hard to keep a hold of and even harder to move. Peter sometimes being cut as he couldn't tell between the after image and the real blade. As the fight continued to ensue, the door would open as Satella would walk in, calling for Peter and asking if everything were alright. Peter and the assassin would both look to Satella. Peter, knowing full well that she was in danger, he would tell her to run. He would move towards her at full speed, moving as fast as he could, as the assassin would throw one of her blades. Peter would move his body over to take the hit, as the blade stabbed him in his left shoulder blade. He could feel the nerves being completely sliced and severed, as he yelled out in pain and his arm was being dragged full of blood. With his left arm completely soaked, he pulled the blade out of his shoulder. As he picked up Satella with his one good arm, throwing her on her back. She would yell that Peter were bleeding, but he would say that they didn't have time and that they needed to run. He would jump across some of the abandoned roofs as they made their way over to the forest. However, the assassin was quickly behind them. Peter tried to swing as best he could, but there was only so much that he could do with one arm. Eventually, a few more blades would fly past them, Satella being hit in the back as well, as Peter would be hit in the leg, and the 2 of them would fall to the ground. Don't think you'll get away from me so easily. Now that you 2 are here, I can't very well allow you to leave. Oh no. Satella! Satella! Who are you? My. You can call me Elsa, the Bow Hunter. Elsa would rush towards Peter, who would just narrowly dodge a few of her attacks, countering with some of his own. Despite being an amateur, Peter was really adept at fighting and thinking on the fly. However, with his left arm completely useless, and now having a stab wound to the leg, it slowed down his mobility quite a bit, as he tried to swing through the forest area to create distance, the blades flying through effortlessly, slicing away at his webbing as he fell to the ground. As Peter would attempt to fight off Elsa, a blast of ice would come out of nowhere. Satella, barely able to stand, would focus her attacks, trying her best to help Peter. Peter would tell her to run. However, Elsa would view this as nothing but a game. As she would continue to dodge the ice and attack Peter, Peter would try his best to get closer, trying to get a decisive hit. However, even when he did, he would take more damage himself. He had simply lost too much blood, and he knew their only chance was to get out of there. At the last moment, Peter would shoot webbing into Elsa's eyes, blinding her just long enough as he would rush over towards Satella, who too were running low on energy. He would get in front of her and tell her that they needed to go. She would say that they had to try to hold her off, but Peter would remark that they were fighting a losing battle. before he could pick her up and swing away. Immediately, a blade would fly through Peter's back and eventually pierce Satella as well, the two of them being skewered by the blade as they would fall over and begin to bleed out profusely. The life would begin to leave Satella in Peter's eyes as their blood was joined as one, as they were basked under the light of the full moon. Hey, kid! Kid! Can you hear me? Huh? What's going on? Hey, I've been trying to talk to you. So you want to buy an apple or not? Huh? What? No, didn't I tell you I'm broke? If you're broke, then what are you doing here? Wait, what am I doing here? Wasn't I at the... Oh no. The loot house! Satella! Peter would look around to see that he were back in the city square, in front of the Apple Man once again. He wondered just how he had gotten here. Wasn't he at the loot house? Wasn't it nighttime? Elsa. Satella, she was bleeding out. He had to find her. Peter would rush through the city as he looked to try to find Satella. He would scream out her name, although this would give him some eerily dark views from the other villagers. It wouldn't be too long after that he would eventually make his way to a town square, where he saw her. Satella! Satella, wait! The young girl would turn around, horrified to hear that name. Satella, it's me! Thank God! You're alive! Excuse me? Huh? Satella, it's me. No, I'm going to stop you right there. Who do you think you are? Don't you remember me? It's me, Peter. Come on, stop, okay? I don't know who you are, and I don't know what on earth would give you the audacity to possibly call me something as taboo as the Witch of Envy, but I'm going to have to ask you to stop. How dare you call me something like that? Peter would be shocked. It seemed as if she didn't know who he was. Come on, you know who I am. It's me, Peter. I don't know you, okay? Look, maybe you need some help or something. I'm not sure. But please, don't ever call me that ever again. With that, she would walk away. Peter would be immensely confused. He had no idea what was happening. How on earth had things gotten back to this point? He knew for a fact that he had been attacked. That pain was undeniable. In fact, in all of the chaos, he had forgotten his left shoulder, but as he reached over to feel for it, there was no blood, no pain. His shoulder was completely fine, not so much as a scratch, neither in his leg or in his back. It was as if he had never been in a fight, as if somehow time had reversed itself. Time, no. Peter would decide to check to see if he were truly crazy. He would walk to the same alleyway as he had once before. When he arrived, as he feared, the three muggers would be waiting for him. He would easily tie them up in his webbing before sitting down as the realization would sit into him. This was either a sick and cruel joke, or he had somehow come back through time some sort of time loop, if you will. He would liken it to a video game. It must have been some sort of save point or somehow. He started thinking about time, though. Time was the real factor here. Did this have something to do with the time stone that Doctor Strange had? But Thanos had stolen it. But something like the time stone could possibly be able to do this. Were the Infinity Stones in this world? Did someone have the time stone? And was he using it on Peter? Or did Peter somehow come into contact with the time stone? All of this was hard to say. As he was sitting there trying to figure out what he were going to do next, a young man would walk up beside him. A man would be dressed in fine white garb, a light uniform, as he had red hair and a sword at his side. He would ask Peter if he were the red and blue dressed one causing mischief. However, Peter would try to plead his case, stating that he wasn't trying to start any trouble, and in fact those muggers over there had tried to rob him. The young man would speak kindly, telling Peter that it were alright and that he were on his day off anyway, but when duty calls. He would ask Peter why he were dressed so funny, and Peter would explain that it was his hero uniform. The man liking a uniform, thinking that he must have been a warrior of some kind. Strangely dressed, but a warrior none the same. The man would introduce himself as Reinhard, Knight of Lagunica, and Peter would introduce himself as Peter, the Spider-Man. Reinhard would ask if Peter could control hordes of spiders upon command or something like that, although Peter would explain that he could do no such thing, and that the webs weren't even organic, but he felt like he's already had this conversation. Anyway, he would tell his situation to Reinhard. However, the moment he tried to speak of his return by death, he would feel as though his heart were being squeezed. Reinhard would see Peter collapse to the ground and ask if he were alright. Peter would look up to him, trying his best to speak it, but it was as if there was some force that would not allow him to say the words. This scared Peter, enough to stop at least, as he didn't know what might happen next. Instead of speaking of return by death, he instead told Reinhard about the girl that he had met, and that apparently he must have gotten her name wrong. Reinhard would empathize with Peter, and he would tell him that he could make up with his friend, as long as he were genuine and upfront with her. Peter would be thankful for the advice, but however, he knew that he had no time to lose. The loot house was going to be invaded. People were going to die. As he looked to Reinhard, he would tell him that he had somewhere that he needed to go, but that if he came across the silver-haired girl, tell her not to come to the loot house, and that he would get what she were looking for soon. Reinhard would make a mental note of this, and Peter would thank him, as he took his bag and he made his way over to the slums. It didn't take Peter too long to make it to the loot house, as he banged on the door profusely, asking for someone to let him in. The door would be opened as a large older man would appear, asking why on earth was he banging on his door like that. Peter would be surprised that the man was still alive and would be thankful. The man asking if Peter was some sort of scammer or something. Peter would explain that he wasn't anything like that, but that he had come looking for a young girl named Felt. The old man would explain that Felt wasn't here at the moment, but if he wanted to, he could wait. Peter, knowing that he didn't have a choice, would decide to do so, but he wanted to try to get the insignia and get everyone out of there as soon as possible. If anyone was going to fight Elsa, it would be him and him alone. As Peter sat with the old man, he would introduce himself as Old Man Ram, runner of the loot house. He would ask what Pierre was looking for, and Pierre would explain that Felt had something that he wanted to get, although he didn't have any money. The old man would explain that he didn't necessarily need money, as long as he had something that might have been of value. Pierre would then realize that maybe he could trade something from his world to here. As he looked through his bag, Old Man Rom would be kind of intrigued at some of the trinkets that Peter had. Namely, it would be some of his snacks, like the candy and the potato chips. However, when Peter came across his cell phone, that was something that intrigued Old Man Rom. Peter would show it off and would try to think of what use it could be in a world with no cellular signal. However, he thought that taking photos might be pretty cool, and he showed him how he did so. Peter liking it to a way of capturing an image in time. Old Man Ron would say that it reminded him a bit of the Meteor, or the Likings that he had heard of, and that they were pretty rare, and that alone could be worth at least 20 holy coins. Now thinking that he had something worth trading, they would wait as soon as when Felt would arrive. Felt meeting with Old Man Rom, who she had kind of viewed as a grandfather in a way. Peter would ask Felt if she had the insignia, and she would indeed have it. Peter would try to make the trade as fast as possible, showing off his cell phone and what it could do. Old Man Ron would vouch that it worked like a Meteor, and it could be worth at least 20 holy coins. Peter would want to rush to make the deal, but Felt would want to wait for her original client and try to get the best offer. Peter would be immensely in a hurry, knowing full well as the sun was going down that Elsa would soon make her arrival. There would be a knock on the door, and this would fill Peter with dread, as he got himself ready in case anyone tried anything. The door would open, and rather than it being Elsa, it would be none other than Satella. She had arrived, and she had come to get back her insignia. Felt would feel as though this were a setup, and she would threaten to run, but Peter would try to calm everyone down, noting that there was no need for violence here, and that whatever they were going to do, they needed to do it quickly. As Felt and the girl would continue in their arguing, Peter's spider sense would go off. At the last second, he would see the blade that were coming in, as he would move Felt out of the way with his webbing, before catching the blade with his webs and throwing it to the ground. Elsa would appear from the shadows. Now seeing that the original owner of the insignia had arrived, the deal was null and void, and now she was simply going to kill everyone here. Well, it seems as though you couldn't follow a simple task. I told you to make sure that the original owner didn't find her way back here. But oh well, it looks like I'll be spilling all of your glorious entrails tonight. You're not getting anywhere near them, Elsa. Oh, so you know of me? More than I like to. I'm going to say this now. If you plan on getting to any of them, you're going to have to go through me first. I look forward to it. Peter and Elsa would lunge at one another. Peter, now being more aware of her tricks, was now able to dodge and move a lot better than he could before, as the two would continue their fight. Puck would appear from out of nowhere, Peter seeing him in the corner of his eyes, along with Amelia firing up their ice magic. He would lure Elsa into a very secure spot, webbing her up before the ice would be launched towards her. However, she would just narrowly dodge as she cut away through the webs in the ice. Old Man Ron would try to get an attack in as well, swinging around his large club. However, Elsa would easily evade the large man's attacks, and would instead critically wound him. If not for Peter moving him out of the way when he did, he could have been dead. Seeing the direness of the situation, and knowing full well that they couldn't stay in this enclosed space for too long, Peter would tell Satella, or whatever her name was, that she needed to help get the others out of here. She would try to protest, but Peter would look at her sternly. As he donned his mask fully, he was ready to take this fight as far as it needed to go. He would bind Elsa in his webs and slam her through the wall, throwing her to the outside, but he would not let up, as he would swing and kick her towards the forest once again. However, this time, his body was completely intact, and he was more than ready to take on the Bow Hunter. While Satella would stay behind to heal Old Man Ram, Felt would begin to run through the slums, crying and asking for help, asking if there were anyone who could come and help her, knowing full well that no matter how strong Peter was, he might get himself killed. Peter would continue his fight with Elsa in the forest, his kicks and punches landing a lot harder, and Elsa was not letting up at all. Her speed made her rather formidable. If not for his spider sense, he would have been dead 10 times over. What proved or could have been fatal wounds were merely light grazes. However, instead of death by mere mutilation, if Peter didn't think of something fast, this was going to be death by 1,000 cuts. However, he could see that he was wearing her down, although he had to keep it up for as long as possible. Although he was starting to get tired. Even for his superhuman strength and speed, this woman was wearing down his stamina. It seemed as though she were relentless. My, you really are a persistent little spider, aren't you? Well, I don't really have a choice. But I'm wearing you down. Always with a quick wit. Even though I can see that under your mask you're breathing rather heavily. Well, what do you have, huh? You're gonna run out of blades eventually. You don't know us bow hunters. If I don't have my blades, I'll use my fangs. If I lose my fangs, I'll use my bones. If I lose my bones, I'll use my whole soul. My whole emotion is relentless fury. And you've been able to weather it so far. But tell me, how long can you keep it up? As long as it takes. So don't worry about it. Peter would stand his guard, ready for the next wave of assaults. However, before Elsa could move in for another strike, a large torrent of ice would push her away. Peter would look to see that it was her, that she was near him. He would ask what she were doing here. She would explain that she had healed Old Man Ram back in the loot house, but that she couldn't just leave Peter to fight on his own. She was going to help him in any way that she could. While Peter wanted her to run, he was thankful for the help. The two of them thinking that if they worked together, they could take her down, although it would be easier said than done. However, before the battle could ensue, another player would enter into the fray. With Felt not too far behind, Reinhard would step into the forest clearing. Well, it seems as though our Spider-Man has bitten off more than he could chew, huh? Reinhard, how did you find me? Well, I was making my way through this area when a young girl called out for help, and I couldn't very well ignore a cry in this moment. I must say, you fight rather admirably, Peter. Although, I think you'd be more refined if you took up swordplay once in a while. As Reinhard would walk up beside Peter, he would pat him on the shoulder. You've done a good job here, but now you can stand down. I'll take care of this. While Peter was going to be persisting to fight, the girl would tell Peter to simply stand down. She could see that Peter was definitely a skilled fighter, and the talk of him and whatever he could do, he was definitely well equipped. However, she knew that no matter how skilled this young boy might be, Reinhard was on a different level. Peter would instead make a hasty retreat over to the sidelines, along with Felt and Satella, as they watched as Reinhard would go to work. He would have to take up the use of a regular sword, as he couldn't unsheathe his, as only the situation were truly dire would allow his sword to be pulled. And this situation simply did not call for it. Well, what happened next would leave Peter in utter awe, seeing as Reinhard and Elsa moved, in a true dance of violence, their blades colliding with one another. The master swordsman and the battle-hunter doing battle under the light of the full moon. Peter would see as a glow would begin to surround Reinhard, his aura beginning to change. Satella would explain that he were drawing on all of the mana in the surrounding area, and that when he did so, he were truly unbeatable. With a great slash, a large explosion would occur, tearing through a portion of the forest area, as nothing would be left but the wreckage of smoldering ash and timber. Peter would be happy to see that everyone had survived and made their way through. He would apologize for not getting her name right. As much as he wanted to tell her, it seemed as though she didn't remember what were going on here. No one did. Whatever was happening, it seemed to only affect him. Although hopefully, that might be the last time. However, before the celebrating could come to an end, Peter's spider sense would go off, as through the wreckage, Elsa would spring forward with one final blade. Reinhard would try to rush over to their side, but he felt as though he wouldn't make it in time. However, Peter, using his spider sense, would just catch the blade in his hand, as a slash would move forward to him, as he would counter with the upper kick of his own, before delivering a right hook, sending her flying into the air as she crashed into the ground. She would get back on her feet, now angered. She would tell Peter that this would not be the last time they would see each other, as she would fade away into the night. Satella would go to check to Peter to see if he were okay, but he would explain that he were fine, although he did have one question. He simply wanted to know what her name was. Her real name. The young girl would be a bit surprised that was all Peter would ever want to know, but she would agree and tell him that her name was Amelia. In the meantime, Reinhard would ask how Peter was able to dodge the blow so effectively. Peter would say that he had something sort of like a sixth sense that allowed him to pick up on danger at a moment's notice, although he didn't know if he were completely out of the woods. As Peter looked down at his chest, his clothing would slowly rip, as a trail of blood would come out soon after. He had indeed dodged the attack, and even the fatal strike. But still, after everything he had been through that night, taking a hit like that was still troublesome. As he would collapse to the ground, slowly going in and out of consciousness. He prayed that this wasn't the end. But if it was, hopefully he might get a do-over. As Amelia went to check on Peter, Reinhard would ask for her to take him, knowing that she would be able to heal him fully, and Amelia would agree, as she knew she were in his debt. Felt would give Amelia back her insignia. However, as she did so, Reinhard would see what were happening here, and his demeanor would completely change. He would ask Felt to come with him at once, although the young girl would be stubborn and want to refuse. However, he would knock her out softly with some of his mana. Amelia would wonder why he were doing what he were doing, but he would explain that with the situations unfolding, he could not afford to overlook them. As Amelia and Reinhard looked up to the full moon, he would tell them to look upon it fondly, as this might be the last calm night they'll ever have. Peter would open his eyes and awaken to see that he were in a bed. He would see that he were not in his regular clothes, but instead were in nice pajamas. As he got up, he would check to see if he were still wounded, but he were perfectly fine. Wherever he wasn't at the fruit stand anymore, so it's obvious that that checkpoint must be gone. However, it didn't change the fact that he were in a strange place. Unsure of his surroundings, he would make his way out of the room as he walked through the halls, seeing as he were in a mansion of some kind. It felt as though he were going in a loop, before eventually he knew that he were going to have to open some door to get his way out of there. As he opened the door, he would soon find himself entering into a library, and sitting in the middle was a young girl, with a pink-like outfit, and with two large, swirling pigtails. As she were reading from a book while sipping some tea, she would look up to him, a bit annoyed that he didn't knock first. "Well, you're rather rude, I suppose." I'm sorry. Really, I didn't mean to intrude. I just don't know where I am. May I, please talk to you?" "I suppose. Come in." As Peter would walk into the library, making his way over, he would introduce himself, and the young girl would do the same. He could tell that she seemed a bit annoyed, but he would try his best to not be too much of a bad guest, as he would ask where he was. She would explain that this was Betty's forbidden library, and that she were its guardian. However, before their conversation could persist any further, she needed to check something first. She walked over to Peter and placed her hand on his chest. As she did so, he would feel as if his body were being entirely drained. "Oh crap, that sucked!" With a loud thud, he would fall to the ground. Beatrice would explain that she were doing a mana touch to see if he were an enemy. However, from what she could see, he were friendly enough, although she would warn that the next time he should knock before entering. Peter would take this into consideration as he passed out. Not too long after, he would awaken once again. As he did so, slowly rubbing his eyes, he would see two figures at the foot of his bed, one with pink hair and one with blue hair, cut in similar ways, although covering different eyes respectively, each one in a maid uniform. They seemed to be almost the same in every proportion, although the blue one was slightly bigger in certain areas. However, that wasn't really what was on Peter's mind, as he merely wanted to know who they were and if they were the ones that helped him. Are you the guys that've been helping me? Yes, my name is Rem, said the blue one. And my name is Ram, said the pink one. We were ordered to help you recover. Are you feeling well? Yeah, I'm fine. Thanks. What happened to my stuff, if you don't mind me asking? They would point over to a wall where his clothing was lined up. They had taken the liberty of sewing up his uniform and cleaning it from his battle. His web shooters were lined up on the counter as well, along with his backpack that had his other clothing and things inside. He would thank them as Emilia would walk into the room, asking if Peter were okay. He would explain that he were fine and he were thankful for all the help that she had given him. They would give Peter some time to get dressed, Peter wondering what exactly should he be wearing. Should he wear his Spider-Man suit all the time? I mean, after all, you never know when danger would occur. Or should he dress more casual? Ultimately, this was kind of hard to decide, but he decided why not just wear his Spider-Man uniform. After all, in this world, secret identities didn't really matter all that much, and he needed to be ready to go at a minute's notice. Although, if he were going to some sort of party or something, then he'll dress better. As he made his way downstairs, he would soon be called into the dining hall with everyone else. As they would all meet and gather together, another man, dressed rather exotically, would enter into the room. Well, it's good to see everyone here has gathered together today. And you are our humble abode guests. Pleased to meet you. My name is Roswaal Mathers of the Margrave Mathers domain in the land of Lagunica. My name is Peter Parker, the Spider-Man. The Spider-Man. So, can you summon hordes of spiders? Why does everyone ask me that question? No sir, I can't do that. As everyone would sit down for breakfast, Peter would learn of the situation at hand. Learning of the political state of Lagunica, how in the absence of its king, the councils that run the kingdom were looking for a new successor to the throne, and that Emilia were one of those candidates. Her insignia was proof of her candidacy, and that was why it was so important to her. Roswaal would thank Peter for helping getting the insignia back, as well as for his fighting skills. From what he had heard from Emilia, he did hold his own against the Bow Hunter rather well, showing that he were truly a man of great strength. He would then ask if Peter would be interested in a bit of a job. Peter wondering what this job could be, he would ask. Roswaal would explain that Emilia did need protection, and that currently she had no one to serve as a bodyguard. He would ask if Peter wouldn't mind being that bodyguard, if he wasn't in a rush to go anywhere, that was. Peter would have to think this over. Sure, being a bodyguard and a hero was fine and all, but there was still the matter of trying to get back home. As dinner would persist, he would tell them more about the world he had come from. New York, being a hero, the Avengers, even explaining how his web shooters worked, impressing them all the more that he seemed to be rather capable of holding his own in battle. All the more reason to be one of her guards. Roswaal would explain that in return, Peter would be paid handsomely, and he would have access to the library as well as the chemistry lab. He was free to use it to improve anything that he needed in his combat skills and any assistance that he had, Beatrice would help him. Beatrice would look a bit perturbed at this, as she wasn't necessarily sure that she wanted to help out this stranger. It wasn't that he were bad or anything, it was just that she didn't like getting too close to people. Peter would decide that if she were the most knowledgeable on magic, then that would be the best help that he could get. Deciding that there wasn't anything else that he could do on his own, and if he were going to make it in this world, he was going to need all the help that he could get, he would agree to it, and he would take them up on that offer. With that, Peter would get to work on his life as a bodyguard. Basically, it didn't really require to do much since they were at the manor, although he would do patrols to make sure that everything was on the up and up. Whenever he wasn't, he was working on his web shooters, looking through the chemistry lab and things of that nature, as well as learning about different forms of magic and magical properties. He was able to fine-tune and make much more stronger and durable web shooters, as well as making the web fluid out of something much more stronger than his original compound. Now his webs were actually water and fireproof, and to some extent could even reduce some magic that could be used against them, if he ever came across such a person. In the meantime, he would work with Beatrice in trying to figure out if there was any way to get home. He would tell her of the people that he had met in his world. He would also ask if there was anyone here who was a sorcerer supreme by any chance, although Beatrice would remark that there was no one in this world with such a title. He would also tell her about the Infinity Stones, as he had no way of knowing if they did or didn't exist in this world. Beatrice would be a bit intrigued at the idea of these so-called Infinity Stones, if they were indeed real and if they had the powers that Peter said they did, although she would again remark that no such power had ever been heard of in this world. Although, if what Peter said was true and that they were in other worlds farther than from just Earth, then there was no way to confirm or deny such claims. Although unknown to Peter, someone was eavesdropping, and the thought of the Time Stone was what intrigued that eavesdropper. From there, Peter would basically continue on as if everything were normal, although he would help out Rem and Rom wherever he could, even going as far as to help with Rem when she needed some spices brought back from the village. And he had even been friendly with the kids, making swings out of webs and different party tricks and things like that, as he was one to have to entertain the children. Although there was one day when this pesky dog bit him in the hand. That was really annoying. On the fourth night, as Peter was getting ready to go to sleep, he felt as though everything were going his way. Maybe this world wouldn't be so bad after all. As he got into bed, he would slowly drift off to sleep. Peter would awaken in his bed once again, yawning as he felt as though today were going to be yet another good day. However, as he did so, he would see Rem and Rom at the foot of his bed. He wondered why they were here to wake him up, as they hadn't been doing so for a few days. They would ask how he knew their names, but he would explain that of course he knew them. They had already met before. As Peter looked down at his hand, knowing that it should have the imprints of a dog bite, it didn't. As he looked down, it felt as though it had never been bitten in the first place. But there was no way. This couldn't have possibly happened. He couldn't have been starting over again. He would rush up out of bed and run straight towards wherever he could find the Forbidden Library. His senses had made him pretty good at finding where the library was. However, before he opened the door, he would calmly knock first to be polite, as the words from the other side of the room would be to come in. As Peter did so, Beatrice would look up from her book. She would nod in approval for Peter being polite enough to knock on the door now, showing that he wasn't completely without manners. However, Peter would not be in the mood. He would ask her if she remembered their conversations about the Infinity Stones, although she would remark that she had never heard of such things, and that prior to their meeting that morning, they had no such conversation. Peter would ask how long he were there for, and she would explain that he hadn't been there too entirely long, although for Peter, this should have been his 5th day. Beatrice would ask if there was something wrong with Peter, although he would slowly back away from her, as a dark realization started to sink in. He hadn't been playing around. This wasn't some sort of trick. For whatever reason, he had somehow been killed, and he was now back at the start. Peter would tell Beatrice that everything were fine and that he just needed to go get some fresh air. As he would make his way outside, Amelia would be there to greet him, as she were worried when she heard from Rem and Rom that Peter had just run outside. Although Peter would tell her that everything were fine, he would confirm if he were indeed back at the start, and it wouldn't take long for him to be reassured that that was indeed the case. This now left Peter rather perturbed, to know now that he had somehow been killed. Someone had killed him in his sleep. Now he had to be even more vigilant than before. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Peter would go about doing everything that he had done before, almost to a perfect T, not wanting to upset the balance in any way. He would go about doing everything that he had once in the previous loop, not wanting to change anything, wanting to make sure that his senses were up at all times. And for the most part, everything was going fine as it had once before, even down to that annoying dog bite. If he does get killed, the next thing he's doing is making sure that dumb dog doesn't bite him again. As the 4th night would come, Peter would be up late in his bed, knowing full well that whatever happened, happened on the 4th night, and that he couldn't afford to lose his guard. As he stayed up into the twilight hours, his mind would slowly start to get a bit hazy. He felt as though he were being nauseous and getting sick. His eyesight was becoming fuzzy once again, almost like it was before he was bitten by the radioactive spider when he had to wear glasses. It felt like that was coming back. But nothing was out of the ordinary. Was he tired? Could he have been poisoned? But if he was, wouldn't he have seen it? He would decide to try to go to the bathroom as he started feeling much worse. As he made his way down the dark halls, he would soon find himself coughing up large amounts of blood. Whatever was happening to him, it wasn't good at all. As he made his way to the bathroom, trying his best to get his bearings about himself, from the darkness in the corner of the room, he could just barely sense something. There was something or someone watching him, but he couldn't tell what it was. From down the hall and behind his back, a large object slammed right into him, slamming him straight against the wall as his skull cracked. As he fell back to the ground, his spider sense just barely picked it up. He could feel blood pouring from his back It was something round and heavy with spikes that had slammed into him. As he tried to get back to his feet, his eyesight was so blurred that he couldn't see what it was that was coming after him. The only thing he could make out was a silhouette. That was all. As the silhouette walked closer to Peter, he would try to stand his guard as best he could, knowing that he had to put up a fight. From the middle of the silhouette's forehead, he could see something glowing, something blue. Peter would then remember some of the old movies that he used to watch. Most notably was the Rocky movie. Rocky. Remembering one of his particular fights when Rocky remarked that he could see 3 of his opponents, being told to hit the one in the middle. As it looked at the silhouette, it appeared 3 of them were walking towards him, although he knew for a fact that it was one. He would then take the advice, using what little spider sense he could to avoid the ball and chain, aiming for the one in the middle and getting in a few good hits. However, for the few brief moments of victory that he got, they were short-lived, as he was beaten and whipped all around the hallway, until eventually he found himself at the ground. He would try his best to hold up his arm to shoot a web, but his wrist would be crushed as the foot stomped on his wrist, shattering the web shooter and every bone in his body. He would yell out in agonizing pain as he looked up to the figure. I am not as forgiving as she is. You've spun your last web. Before Peter could say anything, the voice being too muzzled for him to make it out clearly, the mace was brought down on his head, splattering his skull across the floor as his eyeball rolled in a pool of his own blood. Peter would jump from his bed once again, waking up to the same result as before. From what he had gathered, the only thing that he could conclude was that whatever happened to him on the 4th night. Although, from what he could gather, it seemed as though someone was out to kill him. And if not just him, it could lead to the deaths of everyone else in the mansion. Peter wondered if it was Elsa, if she or some other assassin was coming back for revenge. And if so, had he been poisoned? But that couldn't be though. He knew for a fact that no one else was on the manor except for them up until the 4th night. Could someone have used some form of evil magic? From everything that he could analyze, he knew that something was afoot. As Peter would go about doing what he had done once before, however this time being as vigilant as possible, even going as far as to make sure he watched the food that was prepared at all times. As he continued his research along with Beatrice, he would ask her about any kind of magic that could poison someone or dull the senses. Although Beatrice would explain that something like that might be a curse that could be capable of doing so. He would learn that once someone was cursed, unless it was activated, then it was pretty much harmless. Unless, of course, the spellcaster was killed ahead of time. Peter would be thankful for the information. And in the meantime, while they were talking, Beatrice would comment that Peter definitely had the stench of the witch. Peter would ask just what witch was she referring to. Beatrice would explain that it was the Witch of Envy. Although Peter had wondered why on earth the Witch of Envy had a marking smell on him. although he wouldn't take this information lightly. If she, as a magic user, could sense something that malevolent on him, then the others could probably smell it as well. Whatever this Witch of Envy was, she couldn't be any good, especially from what he had learned from the storybooks that he had read while he was attempting to learn the language of Lagunica, learning of the Witch of Envy's origin and how she had killed the other witches. If this witch were real or somehow connected, what if this had something to do with why he kept coming back? Maybe it wasn't the Infinity Stones. Maybe it was this witch. Peter would still go through the motions as he had once before, although he did take some liberties, such as when the dog tried to bite him. He moved his hand at the last moment. If anything, he didn't have to experience that bit of pain. Although the dog instead would simply run up to Rem. As Rem tried to brush it off, it would bite her on the hand instead. Peter wouldn't pay too much notion to this. Up until the fourth night though, as Peter were up in his room, he couldn't tell how magic could be used. For all he knew, he could have been cursed right then and there. That was when he decided. He slowly made his way through the halls before arriving at Beatrice's room while she was reading. He would knock on the door and she would let him come in. Even though she always seemed annoyed by this, she was never against seeing Peter, as he was a respectable young boy. He would ask her for a huge favor. I suppose I can hear it out. Look, Beatrice, I don't know what's going on, and this is gonna sound really crazy, but I have a sneaking suspicion that something bad might happen to me. And I'm not really adept at using magic, so if you don't mind, you want me to watch after you for the night, huh? Well, if something did happen to you, Betty would be really sad, so I guess I can do it. Hold out your hand. Peter would hold out his hand to Beatrice, and she would form a contract, promising to protect Peter and keep him safe through the night. As she did so, she would tell Peter to make himself at home in the library, since here the stench wouldn't be as bad. Peter would decide to sit in a corner of the room. He and Beatrice would make small talk for a bit, having some tea and reading silently, before he eventually fell asleep. Not too long after, he would awaken, as Beatrice would shake him awake, telling him that she was being called. Peter would worry that something may happen if she left, but she would assure him that everything were fine, since it was already daytime. As Peter opened the door to the forbidden library, seeing the window with the sun shining through, he had made it to the 5th day. Everything had to be fine. But yet, why was there still an ominous feeling around him? He would hear a loud cry from down the hall. As he rushed to see what were going on, he would look into the room where everyone else would be gathered. Rem would be laying in her bed. A dark sense of dread came over him as he walked forward. The others would look back at Peter, Rom being immensely angry, tears welling up in her eyes as she yelled at Peter, asking if he were responsible. Peter would shake his head in disbelief. He hadn't done anything. What could have gone wrong? Why was Rem dead? Beatrice would step forward and explain to everyone that he had been along with her in the Forbidden Library, meaning that he couldn't have done anything as he wasn't adept at magic at all. However, Roswaal and Rom disagreed, their anger boiling over along with their magic. as Beatrice and Amelia stood forward to shield Peter from any attacks. Amelia would ask Peter if he knew anything, even if he wasn't responsible. If he could help, he could please do so. Peter would try to speak. He would try to tell of return by death. But the moment he tried to utter it through his lips, the pain, it felt more agonizing than it ever had before. There was no denying it. There was some force out there, something, someone who knew of his return by death, and yet he couldn't break free of it. Even more so, every time he tried to speak of it, it was as if something were telling him not to. As if he tried to say the words, he would die. Ron would yell to Peter, asking if he knew anything to speak up. But there wasn't much that he could say, as a large explosion would occur in the room. Peter would rush out and simply try to run, his mind slowly beginning to break. He just ran and ran as far as he could, until he was soon at a cliffside, far above the ground, and down below were nothing but jagged rocks, sharp and spiked. Peter sat on his knees, wondering what he could do in this moment, in this situation. Was it worth it to die again? Could he afford to just throw away another life? If he did, was there any guarantee he would come back? What kind of stupid, messed up power was this? However, as he continued to think these things to himself, he would think of the words that he had once heard from someone very important to him long ago. With great power comes great responsibility. Even if this was a curse, in the end, they didn't ask for this. Whatever was happening, it wasn't right, and Rem had paid the price for it. If he couldn't do what needed to be done and save Rem, then was he even a hero? Was he worthy of being an Avenger? Mr. Stark, everyone had put their faith in him. He wasn't going to let it go to waste. As he got back on his feet, Beatrice would soon arrive at the cliff. Peter would turn to her and ask why she was still here, and Beatrice would just explain that she were fulfilling her contract. Although Peter said that she didn't have to do it anymore since they weren't in the mansion, Beatrice would just brush those notions aside, giving Peter a faint smile. They would turn to see Ron, her power fully emblazed, as she wanted Peter to pay for the death of her sister. Beatrice would step forward, knowing that she would protect Peter no matter what. However, before she did so, Peter would kneel down to her level and turn her around, before he would give her a big hug. Beatrice would ask why he were doing this. Although she sounded upset, at the same time she didn't want to let go. Whether she wanted to admit it or not, she had actually grown to respect him, and maybe even like him. Peter would tell her that everything were going to be fine, and that she didn't need to worry anymore. You make no sense, I suppose. Don't worry, Beatrice. Everything's going to be just fine. So are you going to admit it? Are you going to admit what you did? Rom, I'm sorry. I'm going to be real with you here. I don't know what happened. I really don't. But I promise you I'm going to make things right. And how? How are you going to make things right, huh? Nothing you say or do is going to help at this point. My sister's dead. I know. Right now, you probably don't want to hear a word I have to say. As Peter walked forward towards Rom, her power flaring at Peter more and more, as the gusts of her wind began to cut all over Peter's body, Beatrice trying to stop him, but he wouldn't. Instead, he would shoot a web, forcing her back to the other side of the cliff. As she would try to break free, she would yell out for Peter to stop, as Rom and Peter walked forward. I can't stop you, Rom. Taking your vengeance out on me will be more than justified. But even if you don't believe a word I say... Before Peter could finish his sentence, Rom had used all of her magical strength, plunging her hand through Peter's chest, caving in his heart and lung. However, rather than retaliating, he pulled her into a hug, as tears would well up in her eyes once more. It's okay. Let it out. I forgive you. I promise. Everything is gonna be... okay. As Peter's consciousness began to drift from him, even if no one could hear his final words, they were a promise that he made in his heart, strengthening his resolve. He was going to save everyone, and more importantly, whoever this witch of envy was, she was going to pay. Peter would waken to the same scenario as before, although this time he was invigorated, ready to make that change. Before doing anything, as Rem and Rom watched on, Peter would walk up to them and pull them into a hug. He would thank them for everything, and he would say he was sorry for being such a burden. They would look mildly confused, but would tell him that it were no problem at all. Determined to save everyone and stop whoever or whatever it was that was killing them, Peter knew he had to get to the bottom of this and soon. In the meantime, just by chance, Peter had walked out to the garden that morning, seeing Amelia as she were practicing her spirit arts. Puck would explain to Peter the difference between spirit arts and that of regular magic, as Peter would learn that even he himself would be capable of using such things if he could learn what his infinity was along with his gate. This would intrigue Peter a bit, as for as long as he had been here and through all of the loops, he had never thought to learn how to use any form of magic. Puck would check for Peter's affinity, and Amelia would watch, wanting to see what he were capable of. As Puck would check through for Peter's gate and his affinity, a great gust of wind would blow everything. Now Puck seeing that he was a wind user, it seemed rather admirable, as it was great to complement his fighting skills. As Peter thought about it, wind magic might not be such a bad use of a skill, depending on what he could learn. From here, Puck would decide to teach Peter a few wind magic spells, 3 in particular that he thought Peter might find useful. The first one would be propulsion. It was a simple wind user sort of magic. The user would simply blow wind from either the bottom of their feet or the palm of their hands. For Peter, this was something that could be useful, as he already had the ability to stick to any type of wall or surface. If he were moving in an area where he had to move from building to building, instead of using his webs to swing, he could simply use propulsion to push himself across the sky, in case he had to go across an area that was too far for his webs to swing. This could make great use of his webbing, as he wouldn't have to waste it all swinging from rooftop to rooftop, but he could pick and choose when he wanted to rocket through the air with propulsion, or if he wanted to swing. Propulsion could be used to fly, but Puck would warn that that would burn through a lot of his mana, trying to keep up that steady stream of air, and that with his web swinging, it was better suited for a quick burst across the sky. Since Peter could stick to any wall or surface anyway, he wouldn't have to worry about slipping or falling. The second spell he would learn would be the wind cannon. And this, for our audience, the wind cannon, if I had to describe it, think of the spirit gun from Yu Yu Hakusho. Basically being that Peter would focus his mana into the tip of his finger that would be pointed like a gun, and he would be able to blast a gust of wind. The more mana that he focused into the fingertip, the larger the blast. The less mana, the smaller the blast. And finally, the third skill he would learn would be the slicing vortex. This move would be similar to that of Guile's sonic boom from Street Fighter, as Peter would cross both his arms together, shooting out slices of wind. Although this skill is much better suited with something like a sword or a blade. Think of Asuma and his chakra blades from Naruto. With these skills in his arsenal, Peter felt as if he were more trained and more precise, getting more accustomed to using the wind along with his regular spider skills. It made him a lot more nimble and quick, a lot easier to fight with on the battlefield. As Peter would go about doing what he had once before, he would look through all of the scenarios up until now. What had been different? What exactly had he been missing? From what he had learned from Beatrice, this could possibly be a curse. After all, when Rem died, it wasn't like she were killed or maimed through any physical attack. From what Roswaal said, it was as if she simply stopped living. If she were cursed, then he had to figure out who was cursing them. But no one in the mansion was in contact with anyone. In fact, the only two people who had gone out of the mansion during those time periods was he and Rem when they went to the village to get the spices. It meant that whatever was happening, it happened when they went to the village. Peter would decide to test this out. As he would be sent to get spices once again, he would go along with Rem. He would go to the village, but this time he would look at the villagers rather closely, wanting to see if anything were happening in particular. As he did so, Peter would meet with the kids once more, and would get bitten by the dog once again, as the dog would scowl before running off as it had before. Peter would be angered that he let himself get bit by the dog, but he did want to have the authenticity. Although now that he thought about it, there was no way. That couldn't be possible. Peter would pick up the spices, and he and Rem would rush back to the manor. As they did so, they would see Roswaal talking to Ram as he were getting ready to leave. This was something else that was peculiar. Why was Roswaal leaving now? He had never left in any of the previous loops. Roswaal could see a bit of concern on Peter's face, and he would ask if there was something bothering him. Peter would play it off as if nothing were happening at all, although deep down he had now even more suspicion than ever before. Could Roswaal? But for now, he had to focus on what he had learned. As Roswaal would fly off, Peter would make his way over to Beatrice. He would ask her to check him to see if he had been cursed in any way. As she did so, it wouldn't be surprising as the curse would slowly be lifted, a dark mist appearing from out of Peter's hand. Now putting the two and two together, remembering that Rem had been bitten the last time and then she died, then it was the dog. The dog was the curse. Before Beatrice could ask Peter anything else, he rushed downstairs, getting himself fully decked in his Spider-Man uniform. His web shoes fully ready to go as his mask was on his head. Rem and Rom would ask Peter what was the matter, but he would tell them that the town was being cursed by that dog, the dog that was biting people. He had Beatrice check for herself and he could confirm that he was indeed cursed. However, now he needed to go and save the town, to save those kids. Rem and Rom would look on worried. However, Peter would say that he had to do what needed to be done. If they had to stay back, then that was fine. But he was going to go. Rom would then agree that if the village was indeed in trouble, then they would need to do what they could. And she would instead send Rem to go on ahead with Peter, but that they would catch up when they could. With that, Peter and Rem would rush to the village. As they arrived, one of the parents would confirm what Peter had been worried about. The kids had all gone missing, and the barrier that kept the mob beast away from the village had been tampered with. This was all that Peter needed to confirm his suspicions. As he and Rom would rush into the area, they would find the kids laid out in a field, all who appeared to be suffering. Rem would get to work on healing them as best she could, hoping that her sister and that the others could arrive in time. As Peter went to check on one of the girls, Petra, she would tell him that one of the girls had been taken into the forest. Now knowing that someone else was in trouble, he would pick up the kids, carrying multiple of them in each arm, as he and Rem would rush back to the border of the barrier. As they arrived not too far behind, Emilia would be rushing along with Beatrice and Rom. They would take a look at the kids and would get to work on healing them as quickly as possible. Beatrice would confirm that they would have indeed been bitten by the mob beast, and that this was bad. They needed to kill all of the mob beasts, as the kids had suffered from multiple bites, and trying to undo multiple curses at once was easier said than done. Peter would ask what would happen if he didn't kill them, and Beatrice would explain that if even one was left alive, then they would all be dead. With that, Peter knew what he had to do. One of the villagers had come out with a sword, not knowing if it would be useful or not. Peter would take the sword and sheathe it on his back, ready to go out and fight with the mob beast. Rem would call out to Peter, asking if he could do something like this on his own. Even if she didn't want to admit it, she had grown worried for him, for his safety, as well as the smell that might attract them. I know. I have the witch's scent on me, don't I? Yes. Don't worry about me. I promise you, I'm gonna be fine. And I'll be back. With that, Peter would rush out into the forest, as Amelia and the others would get to work on healing the children. Rom knew that she couldn't just wait. She would tell for Rem to go after Peter, knowing that she was the only one with the strength to back him up. Without hesitation, Rem would follow Peter into the forest. As Peter went deeper and deeper into the lands, he would see the young girl that had been missing, along with the horde of mob beasts all around her. "You've been causing me a lot of trouble, you damn mutts. But don't worry, I'm gonna put an end to that tonight." Peter would unsheathe his sword, donning his mask as he shot himself into the air with his wind. As the mob beasts would all jump and attempt to grab him, Peter moved almost elegantly across the sky, his blade twirling. For someone who was not as skilled in swordplay, from what he had seen from people like Elsa and Reinhard, he was a fast learner. Using the blade, he sliced through as many of the mob beasts as possible, but even he could feel that he were being surrounded. However, before they could go any further, a large mace would come through, slamming a few of the mob beasts into the ground. As Rem would emerge, her horn fully activated, she would rush to Peter's side and ask if he were okay, and he would tell her that he were fine. As he picked up the girl, he would tell them that they needed to run. Peter holding Rem in one arm and the girl on his back, he would swing all through the forest. While it was difficult to do with one hand, it was something that he was more than capable of pulling off, slicing and dodging at every mob beast that came their way, Rem swinging her mace to take out a few of the stragglers, until eventually they were at the clearing just before the barrier. Peter would give the little girl to Rem, telling Rem to move on without him. Rem would yell back to Peter that he couldn't take this all on by himself. However, he would tell her calmly that doing things like this is what a hero is supposed to do, and that he wasn't going to die here. With that, Rem would only have her faith to hold on to, as she would take the young girl and make it back to the barrier with everyone else. Amelia wanting to rush over to help Peter, as she too did not want him to get hurt. Peter would turn back to face the horde of mob beasts, all of them gathered together. "Yeah, I know what you want. You can smell it, can't you? The witch's scent. Well, come here, you mangy mutts. I got more than enough for all of you." Peter would charge straight at the horde, all of them rushing at once, led by the tiny puppy that began to morph into its more monstrous form. "So that's what you truly look like. And here I thought you were cute." As Peter rushed at the horde, he would use his slicing vortex. Using the blade of the sword that he had been given, he would slice through at most of the mob beasts, kicking and punching them back all at once, as they were completely surrounding him in a circle. This was exactly what he had been waiting for. Now completely circled in, appearing as if he had nowhere to go, the other girls would yell for Peter, as Peter would throw one of his web shooters into the ground before clicking a small button at the bottom of the wrist. He would use propulsion to shoot himself into the air, as the circling horde all gathered around his original spot. He made sure to jump high enough to not be bitten or scratched. As he did so, the mechanism inside of the web shooter would begin to burst, as all of the web fluid inside of it would begin to expand, moving like a large sticky foam, unable to be escaped. All of the mob beasts in the area had now been congealed together into one giant web-like ball. Now seeing what Peter had been up to, Emilia would use a great form of her ice magic, freezing over the entire ball, not allowing a single mob beast to be able to move, as she would yell for Peter to finish them off. He would focus all of the mana that he could muster into the single tip of his finger, as he pointed his handgun down straight towards them. "This is where you die, you damn beast! Now take this! Wind cannon!" A great burst of wind that had been built up shot straight towards the icicle ball of webbed up mob beast. As the slicing winds cut through the ice, the beasts were killed and slain over and over, as a great explosion blew icy winds for miles. The mob beast had been completely destroyed down to a cellular level, as nothing remained but merely flakes of snow that fell upon the land. As Peter would arrive back down on the ground, not being able to stop himself from falling, and being low on mana, he felt as though he were going to crash. Although he did try to find whatever strength he had left. Maybe he could blow just a little bit of wind to help cushion the fall. However, before his body could even come with the ground, a blue blur would jump straight into the air, picking him up and landing safely. Peter would see that it was Rem, holding him in her arms, happy to see that he was okay. Peter would then be taken back to the mansion, given some time to rest and recuperate. The girls had worked non-stop to heal his wounds and make sure that he was rested properly. Even though Peter had gone in and out of consciousness, a few times he would remember that someone had been holding his hand. Although he wasn't really sure who it was, he had a sneaking suspicion. Eventually he was able to come to. As he awoken, he would see that Rem had been sitting by his bedside, her head laying on the bed. She would slowly awaken to see that Peter were completely fine, rushing over to hug him, not knowing if he were going to wake up. He would assure her that everything were fine and that he were completely okay. However, she was still worried all the same. He would ask if she had been here this whole time, and she would nervously shake her head yes. Peter would be happy by this, happy to see that everyone were okay, and that everyone had made it. His attack had taken out all of the mob beasts, and they were immensely impressed with how he fought. In the meantime, Peter and Rem would have a one-on-one conversation. It would soon lead to Rem telling Peter her story about her and Ram, being members of the demon clan, and the curse of being twins. She would tell of how the witch cult had attacked, and how in the process, her sister lost her horn. Peter could now see what had been bothering her. All this regret that she had been feeling for so long, trying her best to make up for where her other sister lacked. All the same, Rem truly didn't feel as if she were worthy of anything. No matter how hard she tried, she could never be a replacement to what her sister was. However, Peter would assure her that she wasn't a replacement. While Rem was a nice girl and all, in the end, their life was what it was made to be. Sure, Ram was talented in her own way, But Rem was just as special. It wasn't that she had to try to be Ron, but rather, she just had to be herself. Rem would still be worried, wondering if she could ever be that. If she could ever be more than just her sister's twin. However, Peter would pat her on the head, and he would reassure her, telling her that she didn't need to worry about those kind of things. She wasn't a burden to anyone, and she was more than just being Ron's replacement. She was Rem, and Rem was her own person. And that if she ever needed anyone to depend on, she could depend on him. Because after all, he is a hero. But unknown to him, in her own heart, he was her hero. Her amazing Spider-Man. In the meantime, Roswaal would be back at his manor, sitting with Rem as they looked outside of his office at the full moon. He would be impressed hearing how Peter had held his own against the horde of mob beasts. He would ask if anyone who was suspicious had been captured, and Ron would explain that whoever was controlling the mob beast had since vanished as the trail had gone cold. Although, there was one thing that was suspicious. The girl that Peter had saved in the forest had recently vanished from the village, and there was no trace of her. As Roswaal looked on, as he went to work in healing the spot where her horn used to be, Roswaal had many things on his mind now. He was going to fulfill his goals and ambitions, and he had to secure the throne no matter what. Not only to slay the dragon, but there was also Peter. What was this power? What were these Infinity Stones? And more importantly, how could he get his hands on that Time Stone? And this is where we are going to conclude What If Spider-Man Was in ReZero, The Princess and the Spider, Part 1. As always, I want to thank everyone who supports PowerCore Productions and Podcastings, as well as supporting the reboot of this series. I cannot do it without you guys. You make the channel grow. You make the core grow. As always, if you like this and more, don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, and hit that bell for post notifications so you can stay up to date on everything that is PowerCore Productions and Podcastings that has to come out now and in the future. Stay tuned for everything that is to come in PowerCore Productions and Podcastings as we are on the road to 1K and beyond. But anyway, that's going to do it for the end of today's video. I'm Javon Harrington with PowerCore Productions and Podcastings. Signing off, and I'll see you next time.